Okay, thank you so much, John, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here with you again this year. It's been great to see so many familiar faces during the course of the day and to have made some new acquaintances. And, I think aside from being really high quality, I always get a feeling that this conference is so sort of friendly and collegial, and I'm sure that's what keeps many of us coming back year after year. And with that, being the last speaker, I just wanted to thank Ian and the team at the International Security Journal for putting on such an excellent conference, as usual, and to John, as ever, for being such an energetic and engaging chair. My name is Matthew Burnard, and I'm a director at Control Risks based here in Dubai. And I lead our political and security risk analysis team for the MENA region. Go on to there we go. For those of you who are not familiar with Control Risks, Control Risks is an independent specialist risk consultancy. We have a long-standing presence here in the Middle East, and in fact, we've recently opened a new full-service office in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia to serve our growing client and project portfolio there. And we have about 45 or so other offices around the world. And we work with our clients on everything from security risk management to organizational resilience and crisis response, business intelligence, corporate investigations, to political and country risk, and ESG and sustainability. Well, I thought Evita from Marsh did such an excellent job of laying out the global risk landscape, from artificial intelligence to climate change, the kinds of big issues that are going to shape our world in the future and certainly shape our role as risk professionals. And what I'm going to do for the next 25 minutes or so is kind of zoom in specifically on the security threat landscape in the Middle East. And the map that you see behind you here is from Control Risks' annual risk map, where we assess the security risk environment in countries in the Middle East. And the color coding represents the sort of severity of risks to doing business in these countries, and I'm going to kind of talk around this map a bit as I go over the next 25 minutes. And, well, a lot has happened in the region's security environment since I was here 12 months ago giving this same talk last year. The seminal event, of course, has been Hamas's 7th of October attack on Israel, which has sent shockwaves through the region's already fragile security environment. And the primary conflict between Israel and Hamas, focused on Gaza, entered its 8th month, I think, as of yesterday. And we're all aware that that has been extremely destructive. Aside from that, we've seen the conflict spread to neighboring countries, such as Lebanon, where Hezbollah and the IDF have been engaging in tit-for-tat cross-border attacks, and also Syria and Iraq, which have been the scene of a high number of reciprocal attacks between US and Israeli forces and Iran-backed paramilitary groups. We've seen the intensification of the so-called shadow war between Israel and Iran. And not only that, but in the past month or so, of course, that shadow war came dangerously into the open as Israel and Iran carried out a series of direct attacks on each other, which for a nervous few weeks there back in April threatened to spill over into this kind of dangerous all-out regional escalation of all of our sort of worst-case scenarios. We've seen the Houthi movement in Yemen which of course are part of the Iran-backed so-called axis of resistance, targeting shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and causing significant disruption as ship owners and traders have to divert their cargo, increasing fuel and insurance and other costs. And we've seen how all of this has had a direct impact on businesses operating in the Middle East, including here in the Gulf region and in the UAE, whether it's through deteriorating investor sentiment. So, the companies that we all work for, or the clients that we serve, may be putting on hold new plans or investments in this region because they perceive it as inherently unstable. The increased compliance burden that comes as Western countries, particularly the US, expand the scope of sanctions against Iran and step up the enforcement of existing sanctions. And a lot of that burden falls on businesses that operate here in the UAE. Increased exposure to cyber threats, particularly for companies based in the Middle East that have links to countries that are imposing additional sanctions on Iran, or that have operations in Israel, or even just use any kind of Israeli technology in their products or in their supply chains, who face a risk of being targeted by Iranian state-linked cyber activist groups. And even as Yassine was talking about in the previous panel, the direct effects of consumer boycotts and managing corporate communications and employee sentiment around these really sensitive and emotive issues. So with that introduction, for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to do a sort of deep dive into the key parts of this multi-front regional conflict that's going on at the moment, and let you know how we're thinking about things at Control Risks and where we see things going over the next 12 months or so. So firstly, the core conflict between Israel and Hamas, and I'll talk about this in a fairly sort of frank and hopefully objective way, but I just want to acknowledge that it's, this is a really sensitive and emotive issue, and there may be people in this room that have strong feelings about it and have been personally affected, or who have families who've been affected by the conflict. So I just want to acknowledge that. With that being said, Israel's tactics in the conflict with Hamas now seem to be shifting away from the kind of mass deployment of troops that we saw from around November onwards, and towards more targeted operations. So we've all seen that Israel now appears to be launching its long-threatened operation in Rafah, which the IDF in an official statement said is going to be, quote, very targeted and very limited in scope against specific targets. And Israel called on populations in southeastern Rafah to evacuate over the past couple of days, and we've seen Israeli troops and armored vehicles moving to control the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. And Netanyahu has, of course, long indicated his government's intention to deploy troops in Rafah, where the IDF think there remain 4 operational Hamas battalions, and where the Hamas leadership is likely hiding. And the fact that Hamas claimed responsibility for a rocket and mortar attack just a few days ago on the 5th of May against Israeli troops at another border crossing that killed 4 Israeli soldiers shows that Israel still hasn't achieved its stated military objective, its stated objective at the start of this conflict, to kind of conclusively degrade Hamas's military capability and its ability to project force against Israel. So for that reason, I think we can expect that the IDF will likely continue these targeted operations in Rafah over the coming weeks. Alongside that, of course, there are ongoing negotiations for some kind of ceasefire deal. On the same day that Israel started its Rafah operation, you'll all have seen that Hamas had announced that it had largely accepted the terms of a ceasefire deal brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the US. It subsequently turned out that the terms or the language of that deal didn't meet Israel's requirements, but it seems as if negotiations are set to continue, will carry on over the next few weeks, and I think those negotiations will be closely linked to the pace and the nature of Israel's operations in Rafah. So I think we can expect that Israel will use its operations in Rafah as leverage in these negotiations, leverage over Hamas in these negotiations, especially perhaps as it gets closer to the Hamas leadership that's presumably hiding in Rafah. So I think we can expect a kind of stop and go pattern over the next few weeks, both in the negotiations and in the nature of the military operation in Rafah. Overall, I think an agreement for a complete ceasefire will remain unlikely over the coming few weeks, at least until Israel has conducted significant military operations in Gaza, which will likely take at least a few weeks. But following that, I think a gradual de-escalation of the war will become more likely, and I think over the next few months we'll see Israel increasingly engage with international efforts to secure some kind of negotiated sort of military drawdown and end to the conflict, essentially. As to what Gaza looks like after that, that's a lot less clear, of course. I would assume that there would be an eventual handover to some kind of Palestinian Authority-led administration in Gaza with a series of kind of robust security guarantees in place for Israel. Zooming out of the core conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the biggest impact on any other country in the region has been on Lebanon. Hezbollah has conducted cross-border rocket, drone, and missile attacks against Israel since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, and Israel, in return, has carried out regular airstrikes on Lebanon, which have caused casualties to Hezbollah fighters, but also to civilians. But on both sides, these attacks have been calibrated to avoid a full-scale escalation between the two countries. So our assessment at Control Risks is that neither side, neither Lebanon nor Israel, wants another full-fledged Israel-Lebanon war. Neither side wants to open up a full second front in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And that's why most of these tit-for-tat attacks that we've seen have been concentrated in a fairly narrow area along either side of their shared border and have targeted military assets rather than civilian targets or population centers. With that being said, there has been a worrying sign of some more escalatory attacks over the past few weeks. A few weeks ago, on the 23rd of April, Hezbollah claimed that it had targeted a military base between Israel's coastal cities of Nahariya and Akka, which would represent its deepest attack into Israeli territory since the two sides started to exchange cross-border fire in October. Israel responded with airstrikes on southern Lebanon the following day, and thankfully there's been no further significant escalation since then. And we think that our overall assessment will hold, that Hezbollah and Israeli forces will continue to exchange tit-for-tat cross-border attacks while avoiding a significant escalation of hostilities. nonetheless, attacks deeper into Israeli or Lebanese territory, or that cause a high number of casualties, or that target key Hezbollah officials or IDF assets, retain the potential to spark an uncontrolled escalation. And so control risks are war risk rating will remain high in Israel along its border with Lebanon, and also high in southern Lebanon. So next I'll speak about where we are with the intensification of the shadow conflict, proxy conflict, and latterly direct conflict between Israel and Iran. Tensions, of course, have always been high between Tel Aviv and Tehran, but they've intensified even more in the context of the Israel-Hamas war. In particular, the Israeli campaign against the IRGC and its proxies in Syria escalated significantly from around January this year in terms of the pace and lethality and target selection. On the 29th of March, for instance, a likely Israeli airstrike targeting a Hezbollah weapons depot in Syria killed more than 44 people. And then pretty much immediately after that, we entered the dramatic few weeks when it seemed like the nightmare worst-case scenario of an all-out escalation between Israel and Iran could become a reality when, on the 1st of April, Israel killed several senior IRGC leaders in a strike on Iran's consulate in Damascus in Syria. In response to that, on the 13th of April, after much forewarning, Iran launched this unprecedented missile and drone attack against Israel. Of course, nearly all of the projectiles were intercepted by Israeli air defenses, and also the UK and the US and French aircraft, and by Jordan, which claimed that it was protecting its own airspace, and with some intelligence support from some Gulf countries and Turkey. But that was the point where things got really worrying, and there was a lot of speculation, and we at Control Risks, we're doing a lot of analysis about the different ways in which Israel might respond. And that response came on the 19th of April when Israel, under significant pressure from the international community not to escalate further, carried out a precision strike on an Iranian military airbase near Isfahan. So thankfully, Israel's response was relatively limited and targeted, and appears that it was carefully calibrated to avoid a large-scale Iranian response and further escalation. It did, for instance, it didn't target Iranian nuclear facilities. And Iran's response as well seemed to be aimed at de-escalation. Iranian state media downplayed the attack and portrayed a sense of calm in Isfahan, and Iran even went so far as to say that the perpetrator is unknown, which seems a bit ridiculous, of course, but you get the idea. They were trying to sort of diffuse the situation. So in terms of the current situation, we're in a much better place now than we were 3 weeks ago. Iran's reaction suggests that it's intent on avoiding being cornered into mounting a further response. And so I think tensions between Israel and Iran will persist and may sporadically come into the open again over the coming months. But overall, we think they'll likely revert to the pattern of predominantly covert, deniable, indirect operations that have characterized the shadow war over the past decade or so. That's not to portray a complete sense of calm, though. The risk of escalation remains, and even if neither side seeks further conflict, the Israel-Hamas conflict and continued attacks by Iran-backed groups in Iraq and Syria carry a latent risk of accident or miscalculation or misidentification, which always carries with it the risk of an unintended escalation. And then sort of the final part of this multi-front regional conflict that I'll speak about is the situation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, with the Houthis' attacks on vessels and maritime traffic. And this was covered to a large degree in the panel, but I'll offer our assessment. So, yeah, as you know, the Houthi movement in Yemen has been targeting shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden since November last year. And in that time, they've been progressively increasing the intensity and the range of their attacks against vessels. As Hussein kind of eloquently explained, they've predominantly been targeting Israel-linked vessels, although that's now expanded. Certainly to US and UK-linked vessels. So it's not like they're targeting all and any vessels. However, the fact that they are relying on often sort of outdated intelligence as to the ownership of the ships that they're targeting, the fact that they're not using state-of-the-art weapons systems, and the possibility of a mistake or a misfire does make this something of a generalized security threat in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And yeah, it's forced multiple ship owners and traders to divert their cargo around the Cape of Good Hope, which can add over 2 weeks in transit times between Asia and Europe, and significantly increases the cost of fuel and insurance and other types of operational costs. So these costs can be absorbed by bigger firms, but the competitiveness of smaller firms has been impacted, as have supply chains throughout the region. The US and UK airstrikes against the Houthis in January, and the current naval mission has had some success in reducing the frequency of Houthi attacks on vessels, but I think I'd agree with Hussein's analysis that the Houthi intent and capability to carry on attacking vessels clearly remains. And yeah, that's kind of evident in the fact that after the Houthis conducted no attacks for 14 days during April, and then targeted several vessels with missiles and drones in quick succession starting on the 25th of April, shows that intent and capability is still there. And I think the likelihood of further attacks over the coming weeks is only going to increase with the start of the IDF's Rafah operation. The Houthis, of course, have used the war in Gaza to promote their domestic political agenda, which includes strengthening their own domestic support and also demonstrating to the international community their ability to, as a sort of regional security actor that can control this strategic maritime route. So I'll leave it there. I think that concludes my roundup of the currently quite complex regional security threat landscape. And it is a complex picture, but I think with the right approaches and the right tools, many of which I've heard discussed here today, we as security and risk professionals can play a valuable role in helping the organizations that we serve to understand and to stay ahead of and to mitigate some of these challenges. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Matthew, before you leave, can I just give you one question? What are your thoughts around Yemen splitting into a North Yemen, South Yemen, like it was in the old days? Do you think with the way the current geopolitics are in Yemen, do you think it's likely to split up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in some senses it's already split to a degree. I don't see in the kind of short or medium term a scenario where Yemen formally splits into North Yemen and South Yemen, like when Sudan split into Sudan and South Sudan. I don't think there's not the requisite sort of support in the international community for that. But I do think the reality is that the Houthis are there to stay in Yemen and will be the dominant political actor in future in Yemen. So that for businesses operating in this region and for businesses that do operate in Yemen or may wish to operate in Yemen in the future, that brings with it a very sort of complex set of decisions, not least around sanctions and reputational risk. So yeah, I don't see two different countries on the horizon, but I do see Yemen as the Houthis as a dominant force in Yemeni politics in the future.